The November election has been referred to as a political tsunami. Was it as consequential as all that? We'll ask Mindy Romero with the USC Price School of Public Policy, John Myers with the LA Times, Laurel Rosenhall with CALmatters, and Joel Fox of Fox and Hounds.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. So voter turnout in California's midterm election was the highest in decades. Who voted and why? We'll ask our guest, Mindy Romero, who's the director of the California Civic Engagement Project at USC's Price School of Public Policy. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me.
So, general voter turnout, how did it go?
It went great. It was the highest, as you said, that we've seen in decades. Quite exciting. Everybody had, I think, lots of speculation, a lot of, thoughts, and some people putting wagers on what we would see.
I think people were worried because 2014, the last midterm, was so low. This one just blew it out of the water.
It was a record low year, and now we've gone to something that is the highest in decades, and it's quite incredible to see these numbers. And I'll let you ask.
Yeah, well, let me ask you this. There's a lot of reporting about this growing gulf nationally between party identification of white voters with college degrees and those without college degrees. Kind of, they refer to this as the diploma divide.
Yeah.
Is that happening in California?
You know what? It happens certainly in California to some degree. And if you're talking about turnout or partisan affiliation?
Both. Either one. Take either one.
Okay. Well, partisan affiliation is a little bit different because California generally is obviously party registration much more skewed towards the Democrats than the Republicans.
Republicans are now a third, right behind no party preference.
Just fell behind no party preference. In terms of turnout, it's long been the case that we see folks that are, regarding race ethnicity, whites vote more than folks of color, and those that are of higher income or higher education in this case vote more.
It used to be though that the
higher
educated whites would probably vote Republican, and then lower educated whites would vote Democrat. That's completely been flipped, it seems like.
I wouldn't say necessarily. I think we hear a lot about that regarding Trump and Trump supporters. Right. Certainly, I think it still depends on what part of the country you're looking at.
California is unique. I will grant you that.
Yes.
So every election cycle, we hear the same thing, and that is, this is the year that the youth are going to turn out to vote. It's kind of like Lucy and Charlie Brown with the football, and every year people seem to be disappointed, but maybe not this year.
No.
Finally come out to vote?
I think so. So there was speculation about the women's vote, about the Latino vote, about the youth vote, pretty much you name it, right? Mm-hmm. And while we still don't, and we won't have for a little while longer, detailed data on race, ethnicity, and so forth, just looking at those big turnout numbers that we ended up for the general population, it tells us that it's a pretty good bet that we had a more representative electorate. So when you have higher turnout overall, generally speaking, it means that underrepresented groups not only voted more too, but that they closed the representation gap.
And the gap has been fairly large. I mean, I make it simplistic here, but basically young people generally don't vote. Older,
very low numbers.
Low numbers, and older, males generally do vote.
Well, take 2014. Now, granted, again, a record low turnout rate, but those age 18 to 24, their eligible voter turnout was only 8% in 2014.
I don't know if this is correct, but someone cited a fact that there were more people arrested in that age group than voted on a percentage basis. I'm not sure, but it paints a picture of how few of that age group are voting.
It paints a picture. I wouldn't make that comparison, but it does paint a picture. But you know what? This election, it won't be 8%, clearly. Right. And once we get into the detailed data, what's going to be really exciting is we're expecting some level again of that gap to decrease. So we used to be more representative than we've seen in a very long time, certainly in a midterm election. Just how good?
Remains to be seen.
Remains to be seen, but it's a pretty good bet that youth turned out, and certainly anecdotally across the state, we've heard a lot on election day, late on election day, young people using conditional voter registration for the first time.
Yeah, the last-minute voter.
The last-minute voter, but hey, they're voting,
so
and that's exciting.
What does all this mean for 2020?
I think that maybe we're going into a really unique historic period here. The forces at play that produced, at least largely produced, we think here in California, that really high turnout that we just saw, will still be at least we think, or likely to still be in place in 2020. Normally, whenever you have a bump in those trends that we see over time, that bump goes away by the next election cycle. It's not sustained. It's very disappointing. We get excited and then we got to go back to low. 2010 was a very good year for turnout in California. 2014, record low turnout year. So I think we have an opportunity that we could see. Now, presidential is always higher than a midterm, but we could see very high numbers also in that presidential election. And really think about it, these factors have been in place since really 2016. To see this over maybe 3 election cycles, it's a unique opportunity if we do the work and seize on it, that we really could create, in a sense, close to a generation, particularly of young people, that voting becomes a habit. It's not just about one election cycle.
Well, I guess we're going to see, maybe we call that the Trump effect. I want to thank our guest, Mindy Romero from USC. Up next, a post-election analysis with 2 astute observers of state politics, John Myers of the LA Times and Laurel Rosenhall with CALmatters. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. You know, the November election brought us a new governor, a new legislature, but the results may have some thinking the more things change, the more they stay the same. Our guests, Laurel Rosenhall from CALmatters and John Myers from the LA Times, might provide a more nuanced analysis than that. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, John, let me start with you. Gavin Newsom's got to deal with some things that Jerry Brown's leaving unfinished, namely the Delta tunnels and high-speed rail. In his campaign, he seemed to be advocating for this half-a-loaf approach. You know, part of one of the 2 tunnels, maybe part of high-speed rail going through the valley, San Joaquin Valley to the Silicon Valley, but not to LA. What do you think is going to happen?
I don't know for sure. I read the campaign message possibly that way. You're right, Mark, but also a 4-word phrase: take a closer look. I think that he wants to dig down into some of these. I think he wants to see what he makes of it, and probably take the temperature of the politics of it. I think the water tunnels has a lot of really balkanized kind of feelings about it. Delta in one place in Southern California, very popular Southern California water contractors and ag. The high-speed rail is going to be tough. I mean, we just saw this audit recently come out from the state auditor that suggested serious problems with the management of the money. I almost would see those differently. I think the train is going to be scrutinized in a different way. The water is a longer fight, it seems like to me.
What do you think, Laurel?
I just don't see Newsom tackling these things right away. Yep. Even if he does get to them, I don't see it at the top of the priority list. He's made it really clear that he respects Jerry Brown's legacy. He wants to protect it. And I would be shocked if he comes out of the gate just trying to sort of change course very quickly. I think that if changes happen, it will be further down the line.
So, no pun intended.
Yeah, right.
So what do you think in terms of how does Gavin Newsom get out from under the shadow of Jerry Brown? He casts a pretty big shadow.
He does. But Newsom's already sort of talking about a lot of policy areas that would be his own, that are things that Brown hasn't shown a huge amount of interest in. So Newsom's talking a lot about sort of preschool, early care for toddlers, even for pregnant women, obviously healthcare, expanding healthcare, whether it's single payer or some other model, and then housing and homelessness. So he's really sort of talking about that suite of issues that are things that Brown he worked on, but they were not by any means his sort of signature issues.
You could throw fracking on that pile too, I suppose.
You could, but I think that one thing that, in addition to Laurel's list, which is the right list, is the structure of the tax system in California. Mm-hmm. And he has suggested that there's a conversation there that helps pay for some of these kind of programs.
Absolutely.
You did not see Jerry Brown tackle that, in part because we were in a deficit when Brown came in. I think it's going to be interesting.
Oh, that's interesting. That's the 800-pound gorilla for sure. Speaking of big, hairy, audacious goals, John. Gavin Newsom said he likes to do that kind of thing. He set out a fairly ambitious agenda on the campaign trail. What issues do you think are going to get his immediate attention? What issues are going to kind of be put off?
I think Laurel hit some of them. I think homelessness, housing issues, first and foremost. I think trying to set a path for what the fiscal health of the state is looking forward. I mean, we just got this report of a unbelievably large amount of tax windfall that is sitting in there, $29 billion between the 2 reserve counts, possibly by the summer of 2020.
It really is amazing when you think about he started with $20 billion deficits to where we are today. It's amazing.
And so I think that Newsom, pardon me, Freudian slip. I think that Newsom has got to articulate what he sees his path forward about the fiscal health of the state and how you do all of these things within the construct of not running into the red.
What do you think, Laurel?
Well, I think the wildfire issue is going to be back in the Capitol next year in a big way. I mean, we've just seen horrifically the state's worst fire ever, most destructive. most deadly. And Newsom said the other day that the $1 billion legislation that Jerry Brown signed in September was a good first step. So that indicates to me that he's trying to figure out what is the next step going to be on that issue. So that's one thing that may have not been really a campaign talking point, but that's going to be on the front burner. And then I think for 2020, the tax issue that John mentioned, that's going to be huge, but probably not in year one. Probably
this
in
is
year
all
two.
a lot to tackle, though. I mean, this is a lot for any governor.
Right.
Yeah.
And the taxing, in particular, think of split roll, you think of taxing
Right.
services. I mean, it's incredible. But let me ask you this, Laurel. You got a supermajority now in both houses of the legislature. So even if Gavin Newsom wants to hold the line on state spending, is he going to have some trouble in light of the Democrat supermajority that can override his veto and the fact that the LAO just published this report that the finances are fantastic?
Anything's possible, but they haven't really used their supermajority to override a veto in 40
Since
years?
Jerry Brown.
Yeah.
Jerry
so
Brown,
I don't think that's the biggest threat. I think the more difficult thing to navigate is just going to be the kind of different shades of Democrats. If you're with majorities that big, potentially 60 Democrats in the Assembly and looking like about 28 in the Senate.
They start to splinter off into different groups,
Right.
right? A San Joaquin Valley Democrat is very different than a Bay Area Democrat.
Right, and even a Bay Area Democrat who's a real labor-friendly Democrat might be different than a Bay Area Democrat who's more of a tech, Silicon Valley type Democrat.
And the one thing we have seen really quickly in this legislature with these large Democratic majorities over the last few years is sometimes it's harder to get to a simple majority, 41 and 21, especially 41 in the Assembly, because you have so many Democrats trying to cut side deals, and it becomes very complicated, the math in the politics.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about November propositions. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with John Myers of LA Times and Laurel Rosenhall with CALmatters about the November election results. November ballot had a lot of propositions on it. Some passed, some significant ones didn't. So Laurel, one of the big ones that didn't was this $8.9 billion water bond. The general rule on water bonds is that they pass. Indeed, the last time one didn't pass was about 30 years ago. So why did this thing not pass?
There were a lot of negative editorials about it. It was not endorsed by the Democratic Party, which didn't oppose it, but given the number of voters in the state who vote Democratic, if they were looking at a slate card or something, it didn't say do this, And voters may have remembered that it was just in June when they approved another water bond. So there may have been a feeling of just kind of like, maybe we don't need this.
A bond fatigue on water, and also this is the third of a series of bond issues, and maybe by the time they got to the third one, they said enough already, and plus the size of this.
It's possible, certainly right. I mean, it was almost $9 billion out of a $16 billion total take of bonds on this ballot. I don't know, there wasn't a huge campaign for it. It was probably too clever by half. The groups that put up all the money to get it on the ballot all had money allocated for their particular projects. And dare I say it, a plug for journalism. I think there might have been the power of newspaper editorials. There was not a single newspaper in California that I can remember that said vote for this water bond. They all said this is kind of a weird
Pay
deal.
to play.
Yeah.
I mean, it had that feel.
Water's still an issue. I'm sure we're going to hear more about that later. But John, let me ask you about this one. Another one that was kind of strange was the rent control measure. Polling indicates widespread public support for rent control, not to mention the whole desire of local control. This measure gave you both. It gave you the option as a local entity to go into rent control to do that if you wanted to, but it went down to defeat pretty badly.
Yeah, it didn't just go down to defeat. It got walloped. It got shellacked. I mean, to me, this is a classic California ballot measure campaign. This is that campaign where the no side says, beware of unintended consequences. Do you know what really will happen, right? I mean, I'm almost intoning the television ads there. And I think that there were significant questions raised about what this would do in different communities. And that was hard to overcome. But it is fascinating, isn't it, that the polling shows that people are not opposed to rent control. They're worried about the cost of rents and apartments. And yet this got killed.
Well, but that's the key thing. People like rent control, and the Prop 10 campaign did not use the phrase rent control. They didn't use that phrase.
Amazing.
They kind of, their polling showed that the local control issue was going to poll better, and so they emphasized that. But I think it left a lot of voters confused, like, wait, does this do rent control? Does it not do rent control? And whenever you have a thing that's repealing another law, I think it's confusing. People are like, am I, it's not automatically creating rent control.
Another thing that kind of follows up on John's comment, that something typical about this one was the money spent.
Right, that was the other thing. The opponents outspent them by like 3 to 1.
$75 million to $26 million.
Right.
You outspend someone by 3 to 1, you're probably going to win.
Exactly.
It sounds like. So let's talk about the other big one. That's the the gas tax repeal measure, that failed. It seems like Californians over the last few years have been willing to tax someone else, the millionaire's tax or whatever, but they're not so interested in taxing themselves. This was a change. They said, okay, we're going to tax ourselves to improve roads. A sea change or a one-off?
I'm seeing a pattern, honestly. The voters agreed to the gas tax. They defeated the other proposition that would have expanded tax breaks on elderly homeowners, the Prop 13 sort of expansion. And twice in the last few years, they've voted for sales and income tax increases between Prop 30 and then the extension that we had a couple years ago to kind of push Prop 30 many years into the future. I don't know. It looks to me that the evidence points that the anti-tax movement is just weaker than it once was.
It's the two M's, I would call it, mechanics or message here, and I don't know which it is. Mechanics of the campaign, it was awkward to vote yes when you were against something. They were outspent, very much outspent.
Absolutely.
But the messaging, yeah, you do have to wonder if there is not a tilt to the left of the California electorate, historically anti-tax or worried about tax, and maybe now not so much, even to the point that there are some groups now saying we should go back to the ballot and say earmark taxes for early child care or something else. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion going forward.
We're going to find out in 2020 if they put split roll, if that becomes the issue, which likely it's going to be.
Well, it's on the ballot already.
Yeah, it's on. So that's going to be, we'll see. Yeah. So let me ask you this, John. Prop 6, that gas tax repeal, was supposed to help the Republicans that are in some of these competitive congressional seats. It didn't seem to work.
No.
It seems like Republicans virtually lost all those close races. Where do the Republicans go from here?
I don't know. I think it would have been an uphill battle even if they had the money to run the campaign. I already said that. They didn't have the money to run the campaign. I think it was an uphill battle. This wave was real. It was a slow wave of Democrats in California, but it was a wave nonetheless. The party has systemic issues, state and national. And it's like I was talking to somebody the other day, the state party has had problems for a while. The national problems have compounded it. You've heard Republicans just now recently say the Republican Party as we know it in California is dead.
Right.
We've got to start all over.
And that's the former Republican Assembly leader.
Right.
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the future of the Republican Party is one of the most interesting questions in California politics right now. Internally, they're having a lot of disagreement. You have this sort of the movement that calls itself New Way, Assemblyman Chad Mays and Arnold Schwarzenegger, moderate Republicans who are kind of talking about the need to be welcoming of immigrants and embrace environmental policy, and they want to kind of see the party go that way as a way of growing and capturing more people. And then you have the Assemblyman Travis Allen, who's running for state chairman. He's completely the opposite. Embrace Trump, go hard right, and kind of be this other direction.
We're going to hear about how the Republican Party is going to move forward with our next guest, which is conservative columnist Joel Fox. But I want to thank our guests here, Laurel Rosenhall from CALmatters and John Myers of the LA Times. Back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. So what do the election results mean for California's other party, the Republicans? Our guest is Joel Fox, editor and co-publisher of Fox and Hounds Daily, which covers California politics. His background also includes work as president of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association for 19 years, from 1986 to 98. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark.
So Democrats have every statewide office for the third election cycle in a row.
Right.
They've won a supermajority in both houses of the legislature. And for the first time in 130 years, we have a Democrat following another Democrat as governor. Indeed, Gavin Newsom is the stuff really of Republican nightmares, the quintessential Bay Area liberal. What can be done to save the Republican Party from extinction?
Certainly is a one-party state right now, isn't it? It depends what the Democrats give the Republicans, because the Democrats could go wild with that kind of a scenario. Every constitutional office, 2/3 vote, they can raise taxes, they can put constitutional amendments on the ballot. So if they go too far, that would help revive Republicans. And let's not forget, we've heard the death knell of Republicans before. At least I'm old enough to remember that after Barry Goldwater was defeated in the '64 presidential election, Republicans were dead and buried until
Nixon
Ronald Reagan came along.
Well, then also, Nixon in '68.
Yeah. There is no shying away from the fact that the Republican Party in California is wounded.
Bill Whalen, who's a former speechwriter for Governor Schwarzenegger, he's a fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution, has stated that given California's changing demographics, the Republican Party's problem is both its message and its messengers. Do you agree?
I think Bill was with Pete Wilson when he was a speechwriter, and he's a very astute guy, and I think there are elements to what he says. However, I think it's not so much the message and the messengers. I mean, look at some of the Orange County races where there were Republican people of color or Asian candidates, things like that that could identify with some of the minority groups down there. I think it's that the Republican label is tarnished nationwide. If you have that R behind your name, automatically people won't give you an opportunity to make your arguments. And I think it's that tarnished image, that tarnished label, that it really doesn't give Republicans out of the starting blocks.
You know, we were talking about this earlier, and you had mentioned that if you're kind of the proof of your argument is at the local level, Republicans are getting elected.
In fact,
but these are considered nonpartisan races.
Those are nonpartisan races. You don't see that R on the ballot, and traditionally, statewide, Republicans do fairly well in city and county races. Has that changed since we've become so bitterly polarized? Well, I don't know that from this recent election, but traditionally, Republicans do okay in those races because they run on an agenda that the voters approve.
You know, one of the interesting things about this last election was the failure of Prop 6, the attempt to repeal the gas tax. And some people think that now that taxes maybe aren't the third rail of politics that they used to be. Do you agree?
It's going to be tested because the greatest symbol of the tax revolt is Proposition 13. And they're going to start coming after that. Already a split roll in which commercial property would be taxed differently than residential property is qualified for the ballot. As that move forward, they're going to talk about dismantling Proposition 13. That's going to be the big argument. But there's no question that voters recently have passed income tax, sales tax, refused to repeal the gas tax. So there has been a shift on California's notorious reputation as being tax resistant.
So where does the California Republican Party go from here? Do they focus maybe in the short term on the initiative process? Do they focus long term on maybe getting more attractive candidates in terms and issues like things like teacher tenure, public employee pensions? And where do they go from here?
I think that the initiative process will be the vehicle or the tool to try to bring some balance to the ideological debate, because they can't do anything in the legislature, but they can go directly to the people. That's why it was created, to go around the legislature. You go directly to the people with your arguments. And even in this past election, the ideological bent of the voters was not all one-sided in the initiative process, and I don't think it will be. So the Republicans have an opportunity to present some of their arguments through the initiative process.
And what about long-term in terms of issues like public employee pensions? That's increasingly becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Teacher tenure. Are those issues that might be something the Republicans can kind of latch onto?
Well, I was part of an effort with Governor Schwarzenegger a few years back when those two issues were part of his ballot propositions, and they were defeated pretty handily. So there's potential for them to come back. And those are issues of importance, because as the pensions grow and governments have to put more and more money into pensions, they have less and less to put in services, and that's going to become an issue.
Okay, well, I want to thank Joel Fox for joining us. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thank you for joining us.